The ring had been in the Voss family for 112 years. That wasn't particularly impressive by galactic standards. The Soltari kept bloodline relics dating back 40,000 years, and the Keth cataloged their ancestral holdings in geological epochs. But to Sergeant Declan Voss, the number meant everything. 112 years. 3 generations of Voss men who had gone to war and come back, or not come back, depending on which particular branch of the family tree you were looking at. His grandfather had worn it on Omaha Beach. His father had worn it in the ruined valleys of the Balkans conflict, back when humans still only killed each other instead of branching out into the wider universe. Declan had worn it on Kara Station, on the dust flats of Pelorum IV, in the smoldering wreckage of the Outer Belt Relay, when the Keth decided that diplomatic communication was overrated. It wasn't a wedding ring. That point had been clarified, repeatedly and with increasing exhaustion, to every coalition cultural liaison officer who had ever processed Declan's personnel file. It was a covenant ring, an old family concept that didn't translate well into either standard galactic or bureaucratic paperwork. It meant something like this: I belong to something bigger than myself, and I carry that belonging on my body where I can feel it. It was thick gold with a single flat face, worn smooth by generations of anxious thumbs. The face had once held an engraving, something religious, his grandmother said, though the details had been buffed away by the same anxious thumbs. Now it was just a circle of warm metal that Declan wore on his right hand, middle finger, and touched when he needed to remember why he hadn't yet lost his mind. He was touching it now. Voss. The voice crackled through his earpiece with the particular quality of a signal being bounced off 3 relay drones and still losing half its integrity. You reading me? Barely, Declan said. He was crouched behind the skeletal remains of what had once been a Soltari atmospheric processing station, 3 levels of collapsed architecture, frozen mid-fall by some structural accident that had left them leaning against each other like tired soldiers. The planet was called Drevesh Minor in the Coalition Registry. The Soltari called it something that translated roughly to Second Morning, which Declan thought said everything you needed to know about the place. Signals garbage. Try the secondary band. A burst of static, then Lieutenant Ferris clearer now but not by much. Secondary's not much better. Listen, we've got movement on the eastern ridge, possibly Soltari scouts, possibly wildlife. Nobody wants to go find out. Smart people. I need you to go find out. Declan closed his eyes briefly. He thought about the ring. He thought about his grandfather wading through cold water toward a beach that was trying very hard to kill everyone on it, and presumably not spending that walk questioning the fundamental reasonableness of the situation. Then again, his grandfather hadn't been answering to Lieutenant Ferris. How many, he asked. Unknown. Thermal imaging scattered something in the geology here messes with the sensors. Could be 1, could be 12. And you want me to go check this out alone. I want you to go check it out with Specialist Akafer. Akafer is afraid of the dark. Akafer is afraid of Soltari scouts specifically, different phobia. Largely justified, in my professional opinion. Declan stood, checked his rifle, a coalition standard pulse carbine that he had never quite gotten comfortable with, despite 3 years of carrying one, and looked up at the sky. Drevesh Minor had 2 moons, both of them small and pale, and doing almost nothing useful in terms of illumination. The star it orbited was a dim red dwarf that gave the landscape a perpetual quality of late afternoon in November, which Declan had initially found oppressive, and had gradually come to find weirdly comfortable. Fine, he said. Tell Akafer to meet me at the north perimeter marker. And tell him if he screams again like he did on Karis, I'm leaving him. He says he'll try. Outstanding level of confidence from our team. He clicked off the earpiece and started moving. The camp was small, 12 operatives from the Coalition's 3rd Asymmetric Unit, which was a diplomatic way of describing people who were sent to places where diplomacy had definitively failed. They'd been on Drevesh Minor for 9 days, technically conducting a survey mission for possible Coalition resettlement, practically keeping an eye on a situation with the Soltari that had been described to them as a Cold War phase, and felt increasingly like a Cold War phase that had left the freezer. The Soltari Dominion was not technically at war with the Galactic Coalition. They were in a state of contested diplomatic engagement, which was the kind of phrase that someone had invented specifically, so that the people on the ground could be shot at without anyone having to call it a war. Declan was extremely tired of contested diplomatic engagement. He found Akafor at the perimeter marker, a young man from Lagos who had somehow ended up in the Coalition's most obscure unit through a combination of exceptional marksmanship scores and the universe's general sense of humor. Akafor was 26, very tall, and currently vibrating with the contained energy of someone trying very hard to look casual. "Eastern Ridge," Declan said by way of greeting. "Right," said Akafor. He fell into step. "You know what the Soltari do to prisoners?" "Yes. They strip out the—" "I know what they do. I'm familiar. Just checking that you had the full context." "I have the full context. I've had it since Karis. I carry it with me everywhere as a fun motivational backdrop to every mission briefing." They moved in silence for a while, navigating by the faint red-tinged light of the dwarf star and the slightly brighter glow of Akafor's tactical visor. The terrain was difficult. Drevesh Minor's surface was a network of collapsed mineral formations, like a planet that had been given a tremendous geological anxiety attack and hadn't recovered. Everything was tilted at wrong angles. Nothing was reliable to stand on. Declan kept touching his ring. They were 20 minutes out from camp when Akafor held up a fist. Declan stopped. They both went still. Something was breathing. Not human breathing, the wrong rhythm, the wrong depth. Something with a different lung structure, something that processed atmosphere in a slightly different sequence. Declan had learned to recognize alien breathing patterns in the same way that some people learn to recognize birdsong, by spending too much time in places where the specific distinction mattered. He held up 2 fingers pointed right. Akafor nodded. They split, moving around the edges of a collapsed mineral shelf and converged on the other side. It was a Soltari female. She was tall. They were all tall, the Soltari, built long and lean in ways that made humans feel architecturally inadequate. And she was alone, which was the first unusual thing. Soltari didn't travel alone. It was a cultural prohibition so deeply embedded that the word for alone in their language was etymologically linked to the word for shamed. They traveled in pairs at minimum, in diplomatic retinues and military squadrons and family clusters, always touching or nearly touching, always connected. She was alone and she was wounded. The wound was along her left side. Declan could see the bioluminescent fluid that served as Soltari blood, a pale silver blue that was currently doing a lot of leaking. She had pressed herself into a crevice in the mineral shelf, making herself as small as her considerable height allowed. Her eyes, 4 of them, arranged in a horizontal row across her upper face, were scanning the ridge above her in rotating patterns. She hadn't seen them yet. The crystalline nodes along her spine, which Declan knew served as secondary sensory organs, were dimmed. Stress response or blood loss, possibly both. He made a decision before he'd entirely finished thinking about it. That was always how his decisions went. Some people deliberated. Declan Voss got hit by conclusions like trucks. He stepped out from behind the mineral shelf and said, in his best approximation of Soltari formal register, "I am not hunting you." His pronunciation was probably terrible. Soltari was a tonal language with physical components. Some meaning was carried in the resonance of those spinal nodes, which humans couldn't replicate. So the best Declan could manage was the verbal skeleton of a sentence, stripped of its full nuance. But the bones of the phrase were clear enough. She went absolutely still. All four eyes locked onto him. She didn't raise her weapon, she had one, a slender energy lance that she'd been cradling against her wounded side, but she didn't lower it either. "Human," she said. Her standard was excellent, which surprised him. Most Soltari he'd encountered used translation devices as a point of cultural pride, refusing to demean themselves with another species' language. "Yes," he said. "Coalition, not a question." "Yes." "You are on territory claimed by the Dominion." Each word was precise, measured. She was in tremendous pain. He could see it in the tension of her jaw, in the way her fingers had gone rigid around the lance, but her voice was completely steady. That took discipline that made his professional respect activate against his will. "Technically, it's contested territory," he said. "That's why we're both here being miserable on a planet with 2 useless moons." A pause. Something shifted in her 4 eyes, the equivalent of a raised eyebrow, maybe. He couldn't read Soltari micro-expressions well enough to be sure. "You are injured," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't see that. It is of no concern to you. Where's your unit?" Another pause, longer. The kind of pause that answered the question without words. "You're alone," Declan said quietly. No answer, which was its own kind of answer. Behind him, he heard Akafor take a very careful breath, the breath of someone preparing either to speak or to run, and Declan genuinely wasn't sure which it would be. He reached into his field kit. She raised the lance. "Medical," he said, holding up the kit where she could see it. "I'm reaching for medical supplies, not a weapon." A very long silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, the lance lowered 3 centimeters. Declan Voss, Sergeant, 3rd Asymmetric Unit, Coalition Armed Forces, crouched down in front of a wounded Soltari female on a planet that was technically not anyone's territory on a mission that was technically not combat, and began the most carefully narrated first aid application of his entire career. He did not think about what Lieutenant Ferris was going to say. He touched his ring briefly and got to work. Chapter 2: The Stranger. Her name was Jaril. She did not offer it. He didn't ask. Names in Soltari culture were not casual currency. They were offered formally with context when the social relationship warranted it. Asking a Soltari stranger for their name was the rough equivalent of asking a stranger on a street corner for their home address. Possible in extreme circumstances. Not a good look. He found her name later from a different source in a way that would change everything. But that was later. Right now she was bleeding onto the rocks of Drevesh Minor and watching him with 4 eyes that gave nothing away, while he tried to seal a wound he'd never seen the anatomy for. Soltari biology was different from human biology in ways that were well documented in the Coalition's xenobiological databases, and considerably more alarming in person. The bioluminescent fluid that served as blood was thicker than human blood, slower to clot, and it carried both nutrients and something analogous to nerve signals, meaning that Soltari blood loss was simultaneously more dangerous and more painful than the human equivalent. The wound along her side had cut through the outer integument, the sublayer of crystalline lattice tissue that gave Soltari their characteristic slight shimmer, and into what the xenobiology files called the visceral matrix. Declan's field medic training had covered Soltari first aid in approximately 40 minutes of a 3-week course, most of which had been theoretical, and he had spent those 40 minutes with the private conviction that the information was academic. It was not academic. "I need to seal this," he said. "I have a bioadhesive, but it's human formulated. I don't know if it'll react badly with your biology. There's a risk." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Apply it." "You understand the risk." I understand that I am currently losing structural fluid at a rate that will compromise my motor function within 40 minutes. Apply it. A pause. Please. The please came out stiff, a word from a language that her mouth wasn't built for, in a register that wasn't natural to her. It cost her something. He could see that. He applied the bioadhesive. It was not a comfortable process for either of them. The adhesive had to be worked into the wound edges, and working anything into a wound created a particular kind of intimacy that Declan was deeply uncomfortable with under normal circumstances, and was currently performing on a member of a species his government was in a state of contested diplomatic engagement with, which somehow made it both more and less strange. She didn't make a sound. He'd treated humans who'd cried from smaller wounds. He'd seen trained soldiers lose composure in the field medic's chair. Jarrell of the Soltari Dominion sat with her back against a mineral shelf on a hostile planet with a hole in her side and her 4 eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance, and she did not make a sound. "Okay," he said when the adhesive had set. "That'll hold the edges. The clotting still needs to happen naturally. You need to stay still for." "I cannot stay still. I have to reach the secondary extraction point before local dawn. If I am not there," she stopped, reorganized whatever she'd been about to say. "It matters." "Where's the extraction point?" "That information is not available to you." "I'm trying to help." "You are coalition forces on contested territory. You have already exceeded the parameters of what assistance I am able to accept." She shifted, testing the wound. Her jaw tightened. "I am grateful for the medical treatment. You should return to your unit." Declan did not return to his unit. He also did not consciously decide not to return to his unit. What happened was that he stood up, looked at the direction she would need to travel, assessed the terrain and the timeline and the state of her wound, and arrived at the truck-hitting-him conclusion that leaving now would be equivalent to sealing her wound and then personally reopening it, and that he wasn't going to do that. "Eastern extraction point," he said. "Has to be. There's nothing to the west except the collapsed relay station, and north and south are both coalition monitored. Has to be the Soltari cache at the base of the ridge, the one you think we don't know about." She was quiet. "We've known about it for 4 days," he said. "We haven't reported it because, honestly, because nobody wanted to write the report that would trigger an engagement protocol. We're all very tired." Something in her expression shifted, something small, but he caught it. "About 3 kilometers," he said. "Rough terrain. Your wound will hold if you don't stress it, but 3 kilometers of rough terrain is going to stress it. I am aware of the logistics. I'll help you. That is not a request. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." He looked at her directly, all 4 of her eyes, since there was no polite way to choose. "You can object. You can refuse. But I'm going to walk 3 kilometers in the direction of the extraction point regardless, because I need to check the perimeter anyway, and if you happen to be going the same direction, that's a coincidence." A very long silence. "Then your unit is not going to know I extended the patrol radius. Akafor." He turned to where Akafor was standing very still against the mineral shelf, absorbing all of this with the expression of a man having the most interesting and possibly most consequential night of his life. "Radio check. Tell Ferris we found wildlife, some kind of large mineral predator. Took us off track a bit. We're doing extended sweep." Akafor looked at Jarrell, looked at Declan, looked at the sealed wound. "You are going to owe me," Akafor said, "something enormous. I'll buy you dinner on Kara Station." Kara Station exploded. "Then I'll buy you dinner somewhere with the same vibe." Akafor started talking into his communicator. Jarrell watched all of this. Her expression, insofar as Declan could read Soltari expressions, which he would have rated his own ability at roughly 20%, had gone through several phases: wariness, assessment, something that might have been surprise, though it looked different on a face with 4 eyes, and finally, something he couldn't name at all. Why, she said. The question was simple. It deserved a simple answer, and he didn't have one, so he gave her the nearest thing to the truth. Because you're hurt and you're alone, he said, and that's too many problems for one person to carry. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed herself upright slowly, carefully, with the control of someone who had been trained to show nothing, and she said, in the formal register of high Soltari that he only half understood, "Then walk." They walked. The 3 kilometers took an hour, because the terrain was genuinely brutal and because he was matching her pace, which was slower than he expected from her. She was compensating, keeping her wounded side from rotating. He noticed when she favored it. He adjusted their path twice to reduce the grade they were climbing without drawing attention to the adjustment. She noticed. He could tell by the way her spinal nodes flickered briefly, a signal he didn't have enough cultural vocabulary to decode, but which felt like acknowledgement. They didn't talk much. What they did do was navigate together, the way that people navigate who have both been in the field long enough that communication becomes economical. A gesture for stop, a tilt of the head for listen, the universal vocabulary of people who survive by paying attention. At one point, he saw movement on the ridge above them, something that could have been a Soltari scout, could have been the wildlife he'd reported to Ferris, and he put out an arm without thinking, a purely instinctive gesture that put his body between her and the potential threat. She went still. The movement on the ridge resolved into wind-shifted mineral fragments. He lowered his arm. "Your kind does that," she said. "Does what?" "Steps in front, puts the body between." "It's a reflex," he said. "Combat instinct." "For whom do you have the instinct? For threats to yourself or for threats to others?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought about it. The ring was warm under his thumb. "Both," he said finally. "Can't really separate them." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Among my kind, that reflex belongs only to those of blood bond, or to the sworn protectors of a royal house." "What does it mean when a stranger does it?" Another of those small, unreadable shifts in her expression. "I do not know," she said. "It has not previously been a question I required an answer to." They reached the extraction cache 20 minutes before local dawn. The cache was exactly where Declan had calculated, a hollowed section of the ridge base, sealed with a biolock that Jarrell opened with a sequence of tonal resonances from her spinal nodes. The door slid aside to reveal a space barely large enough for 3 people, stocked with Soltari emergency supplies and a communication relay. She turned in the doorway. For a moment she just looked at him. The dawn was beginning to happen on the horizon, the red dwarf doing its minimal best, painting everything in shades of rust and amber. It caught the bioluminescence in her skin, the silver blue of her complexion deepening at the edges into something that looked almost purple. "Sergeant," she said. He blinked. "How do you know my rank?" "Your insignia," she said. "I have been trained in coalition military identification, as you have likely been trained in Soltari command markings." A slight pause. "Though I note you have identified none of mine, which is either courtesy or ignorance." "Courtesy," he said, "mostly." Something that might have been the Soltari equivalent of a smile, not the same as a human smile, but something in the same emotional neighborhood. Quick, controlled, not entirely voluntary. "I owe you a debt," she said, formal register again. The words seemed to cost her something. Among the Soltari, from what he knew, debts of life were significant obligations. They weren't acknowledged lightly. "I do not know your name." "Voss," he said. "Declan Voss." She repeated it, the syllables slightly rearranged by her phonology but recognizable. "Declan Voss," a beat. "I am," a pause. "The acknowledgement of debt requires the offering of name in context. I am Jaril, of House Soltari. Another pause, smaller, first daughter. He didn't know what first daughter meant in the specific hierarchy of the Soltari Dominion. He filed it away for later. Get some rest, he said. How long until your extraction? 6 hours. Your wound will hold that long if you keep the adhesive dry, and don't rotate the injured side. She nodded, a gesture she'd picked up from somewhere, slightly off rhythm but unmistakable. He turned to go. Sergeant Voss. He looked back. She was looking at his hand, at the ring. Something had shifted in all 4 of her eyes simultaneously. The kind of shift that happened when every sensory system in a body reacted to the same thing at once. That, she said carefully, what you wear on your hand. Family heirloom, he said, old tradition. She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. I see, she said finally. Safe passage, Sergeant Voss. He walked back to camp in the early red light of a dying star morning and tried to figure out why that look had stayed with him. He couldn't. He told himself it didn't matter. He was wrong about that. Chapter 3, The Problem. The report he didn't file came back to find him 3 days later, dressed as a military tribunal. Not a formal one, not yet. Just a conversation is how Colonel Reyes phrased it, which was the kind of phrasing that experienced soldiers recognized as the prelude to a formal one. Declan sat across from Colonel Reyes in the field command tent on Drevash Minor and felt the very specific texture of the moment where things started to go wrong. We have footage, Reyes said. Of what? Of you escorting a Soltari female across 3 kilometers of contested territory to a known Soltari cache, which you had identified and failed to report. I reported encountering wildlife. Sergeant. He said nothing. Reyes set a data pad on the table between them. The footage was drone-captured, grainy, but clear enough him, Akafir Jaril, moving through the mineral formations in the pre-dawn dark, his arm going out in front of her. Who is she? Reyes asked. Wounded combatant seeking shelter, civilian injury from what I could assess, no hostile action toward coalition personnel. Sergeant, who is she? Declan had learned, across 9 years of irregular military service, that the moment you tried to manage information was the moment the information started managing you. He'd learned that lesson by watching other people fail at it, and occasionally by failing at it himself. She said her name was Jaril, he said, of House Soltari, first daughter. A very long silence. Colonel Reyes sat back in her chair and looked at him with the expression of a person recalculating everything they had previously understood about a situation. First daughter, she said. Yes. As in, the first daughter of the Soltari Dominion. Is that a specific? That is a very specific title, Sergeant Voss. Reyes stood up. She was not a person who paced. She was too controlled for that, but she stood up, which was the Colonel Reyes equivalent of pacing. The first daughter of the Soltari Dominion is the heir apparent to the sovereign's position. She outranks every Soltari diplomat, military commander, and envoy currently operating in this sector by several orders of magnitude. He processed this. She's their princess, he said. She is their crown princess. She is currently listed as missing by the Soltari Dominion, which has triggered a Dominion-wide military alert, which has in turn triggered coalition crisis protocols, which is why I have 4 admirals breathing down my neck on the communication channel, and why your extremely cozy wildlife walk has become my problem. Reyes looked at him. What did you talk about? Wound treatment logistics, walking pace, terrain. That's it. She asked about my ring. Another silence, different quality. Your ring, Reyes said. Family heirloom, she seemed, he paused, that look, all 4 eyes something reacting, interested in it. What did she say? She asked what it was. I told her. She said she saw, he frowned. Her exact words were "I see," which I took as acknowledgement. But her expression. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't know how to finish it without sounding like he was reporting feelings about an enemy's facial expression, which was not, to his knowledge, a recognized category of military intelligence. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. She had her data pad in hand and was looking at something on it, something she'd pulled up during his account. "Sergeant Voss," she said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer." He waited. "During your contact with the first daughter of the Soltari Dominion, did she at any point touch any item on your person? Any item that belongs to you personally?" He thought back, the medical treatment when he'd been working on her wound, his hands her wound. He'd handed her the bioadhesive tube at one point and then taken it back. Had she? "My ring," he said. Very quiet in the tent. "When?" Reyes asked. "During the medical treatment." He was pulling it back clearly now. He'd been working on the wound edge. He'd reached across himself and his ring hand had come within her reach, and she steadied my hand. She pressed her fingers over mine for about 3 seconds. I thought it was to hold the angle. He stopped. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Reyes sat back down. She turned the data pad to face him. On the screen was a section of the Coalition Xenocultural Treaty Database, subsection 47, under Soltari Cultural Practices, Bonding Rights and Their Legal Recognition. He read the relevant passage. He read it again. Then he read it a third time, because the human brain has a natural resistance to information that dramatically alters the structure of its current reality. The Covenant Touch, as the Coalition database translated it, the direct term was an untranslatable tonal phrase, was the foundational bonding right of Soltari culture. Contact initiated by a Soltari individual with a personal ancestral item belonging to a non-bonded individual, performed in a context of witnessed life-debt acknowledgement, constituted under Soltari law, and by extension, under Coalition treaty law, a formal declaration of bond claim. Bond claim, the database helpfully clarified, was the Soltari term for the permanent biological, social, and legal bond that in human culture was most closely approximated by the institution of marriage. With the database added, the additional dimension that the bond claim also established the claiming individual as belonging to the claimed individual's bloodline for purposes of inheritance, property rights, protection obligations. And this was where it got particularly creative on a response requirements, meaning that any harm to either party by a third party created an obligatory response from the bonded pair. "She claimed me," Declan said. "Under Soltari law and under Treaty Article 17, yes." Reyes's voice was perfectly flat. "When she touched your ring, an ancestral item, in the context of a documented life debt, with Specialist Okafor as an inadvertent witness, she initiated a covenant touch. According to our treaty obligations, we are required to recognize this. She claimed me like property." "It's less like property and more like," Reyes paused, "more like a declaration of kinship and partnership simultaneously. There's no great human analog. The closest thing is if you simultaneously proposed marriage and adopted someone into your family in a legally binding ceremony that you only had to perform one side of and the other party had to recognize." The inside of the tent was very quiet. Outside, the red dwarf light was doing its perpetual thing with the dust. Someone in the camp was playing music, a guitar, which Declan recognized as belonging to Corporal Hesse, who played badly and constantly and was beloved for both qualities. "She knew what she was doing," Declan said. "Almost certainly. She saw my ring, she asked about it, she filed it." He was thinking back through the conversation, through every second of it, recontextualizing. "She knew it was an ancestral item before she touched it. She set it up." That is the most likely interpretation, yes. He sat with that for a moment. He should feel manipulated. He examined himself for the feeling. He found it, under other things, under the memory of her sitting completely still while he worked on her wound, under her voice saying please with the weight of someone who didn't say it easily, under 4 eyes watching him with an expression he hadn't been able to read. Why, he asked. The most obvious theory is political, Reyes said. She's the crown princess. She was alone and wounded on a hostile planet. If she'd been recovered by her own forces in that state, or not recovered at all, there would have been consequences for her status. A Soltari of her rank traveling alone is already a significant social vulnerability. Being visibly rescued by a human soldier, with the wound as evidence of what she survived, transforms her into something else. Something else. Soltari society has a concept they call shadowkin. Reyes pulled up another section of the database. Individuals from outside the Dominion who form bond claims with Soltari nobility effectively become part of the political web of the Dominion. They can't be harmed without triggering diplomatic obligations. They can't be used as leverage because the bond claim prevents it. And the Soltari partner, she looked up, is placed under their bloodline's protection from outside threat, which for a crown princess who was mysteriously alone and wounded is possibly extremely important. Declan stared at the data pad. She protected herself, he said, by claiming me. It's the operating theory. And what happens now? This was the question that had a complicated answer. He could tell by the way Reyes looked at the data pad, then at him, then at something in the middle distance that wasn't either of them. The Soltari Dominion is aware she's been found, Reyes said. They're sending a diplomatic retrieval team. They'll be here in approximately 36 hours. A pause. They have also, apparently, sent a formal notification to Coalition headquarters recognizing the Covenant touch and its treaty implications. As of 6 hours ago, Sergeant Declan Voss, you are registered in the Coalition's treaty database as the bond-acknowledged partner of First Daughter Jaril of House Soltari. He sat with that. The guitar outside was playing something he recognized, an old melody, simple, the kind of thing that had been old before anyone alive had been born. Hess's version was technically imperfect and somehow exactly right for that reason. Does she know we know? He asked. The formal notification was sent by the Dominion, by her house, which means she knew it would trigger this conversation. Reyes looked at him steadily. She knew we would figure it out. She's waiting to see what we do. Or, Reyes said, she's waiting to see what you do. Chapter 4, The Choice. Akaffer brought him a coffee at some point, which was the kind of thing Akaffer did when he understood that a situation was bad and wanted to contribute something and couldn't think of what. Declan sat outside the command tent, with the coffee going cold in his hands, and the ring on his finger and the guitar still playing somewhere across the camp, and tried to work through the situation with the same systematic logic he applied to extraction planning and threat assessment. Systematic logic was failing him. The situation in logical terms. A member of an enemy political entity had, under treaty law, initiated a binding legal bond with him without his consent. The bond had diplomatic and military implications for both his government and hers. He had not known about these implications when the bond was initiated. She had. The situation in human terms. He'd helped a wounded woman get home. She'd touched his ring. His grandfather had worn that ring on Omaha Beach. Now, according to 3 different legal frameworks, they were something approximating married. He thought about her sitting with a hole in her side and not making a sound. He thought about the word please coming out of her mouth like it cost her something real. He thought about all 4 of her eyes going to his ring and the shift that had moved through them. Not calculation, he thought now, replaying it. He'd initially read it as calculation, and now he wasn't sure. He'd seen calculation in people's eyes enough times to know the shape of it. That look had been something else, something that lived in a different neighborhood. Recognition, maybe. Not of the ring specifically, of what the ring meant. She'd asked him and he'd said family heirloom, old tradition, and she'd said I see, and something in her face had responded, like hearing a language you'd thought was dead. HFY sat down next to him. "You're not going to ask," Declan said. "I am absolutely going to ask," HFY said. "I'm just giving you a moment first because you look like a man who's been hit by a concept and needs to process it." "That's a fair assessment." A pause, the guitar, the red dwarf light, the two useless moons, currently both visible, doing their minimal thing. "She did it on purpose," Declan said. "Yeah, I gathered that part." HFY was quiet for a moment. "Does that make it worse or better?" "I don't know yet." "Because the way I see it," HFY started again. "The way I see it, she was alone and injured, and if her own people found her like that, it was going to be a problem for her. And she had options. She could have fought us. She could have run. She could have waited and hoped we left before she bled out. Instead, she let you treat the wound, and then a pause. She tied herself to you, specifically, not just to any coalition soldier. She looked at you and she picked you." Declan turned the ring on his finger. "That's a romantic reading," he said. "I grew up with 3 sisters," HFY said. "I have a high tolerance for romantic readings of situations that look complicated from the outside." Declan thought about this. "What are they going to do with her?" he asked, "when the retrieval team gets here?" HFY didn't answer immediately. "Rays didn't say," Declan said, "but there was something in how she talked about it. Something about the first daughter being alone and wounded. Something she wasn't telling me." "I did some reading," HFY said. "After our post-meeting meeting where Ferris told me I was being written up for filing a false report, and I told him that was the least of our problems. While I was waiting to get yelled at, I did some reading." He hesitated. "There's some internal political stuff happening in the Dominion. Contested succession situation. The sovereign, her parent, is ill. There are 2 factions. One of them supports Jarrell as heir. The other one," he stopped. "Doesn't," Declan said. "And the other faction has a vested interest in her not making it back." The guitar paused between songs. The silence was loud. "She was alone," Declan said, "because whoever got her alone wanted her to stay that way." "That's what the reading suggests." HFY looked at him sideways. "And when the retrieval team shows up in 36 hours, it's a retrieval team sent by the Dominion. We don't know which faction sent it." Declan stared at the horizon. The thing about being hit by conclusions was that it could happen twice. The first one, 3 days ago, had been I'm going to help this woman because she's hurt and alone. This one was longer and more complicated and arrived with the same absolute certainty. "I need to talk to her," he said. "Rays is going to love that. Rays is going to have to deal with the fact that I'm apparently, by treaty law, her problem now." He stood up. "Or hers, depending on how you look at it." "How are you looking at it?" He touched the ring, his grandfather on a beach, his father in a valley. Him on a planet with 2 useless moons, and a woman who had looked at a piece of warm gold and seen something worth choosing. "I'm looking at it," he said, "as a situation that needs more information and fewer assumptions." Rays let him go, which surprised him, but Rays was a pragmatist, and she'd done the same reading as HFY, and she understood that a sergeant who was treaty bonded to a crown princess was either an asset or a liability, depending entirely on how the next 36 hours went. The walk to the extraction cache felt different in daylight. The terrain that had been navigated by touch and instinct in the pre-dawn dark was visible now. The tilted shelves of mineral, the collapsed formations, the places where the ground had given up being horizontal. He could see how it had looked to her, wounded, trying to move through it alone. How it had looked to him, deciding without deciding to put his body between her and the ridge. The cache door opened before he reached it. She was standing in the doorway. She'd known he was coming, the spinal nodes probably, which had sensory range well beyond human equivalents. Her wound was dressed with Soltari medical materials from the cache supplies, different colors and textures than what he'd used, but the bioadhesive line was still visible at the wound edge. She'd cleaned up. She looked, standing in that doorway with the red morning light hitting her, like the heir to something significant, which he supposed she was. "Sergeant Voss," she said. "You know why I'm here," he said. "I know several things you might be here for. I am uncertain which one." He stopped in front of her, close enough to talk quietly. "You knew what you were doing when you touched my ring." A pause. Her spinal nodes caught the light. "Yes," she said. No deflection, no reframing, just yes. "Why me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The four eyes, rotating slightly in their independent way, converging on him. "You stepped in front," she said. "I explained that." "You said it was a reflex." Her voice was even. "I know the difference between a reflex and a choice, Sergeant Voss. When the object on the ridge moved, your reflex had a half-second to operate before your conscious mind engaged. Your reflex chose to put your body between me and a threat." She paused. "I am the heir to a political structure that has been trying to kill or neutralize me for 3 years. I have extensive experience identifying the difference between people who protect because they are instructed to, and people who protect because they cannot do otherwise." He was quiet. "Also," she said, and something in her voice shifted, something that was probably the Soltari equivalent of admitting something difficult. "Your ring." "My ring." "What it means among your kind. You explained it in simple terms: family, continuity, belonging." The spinal nodes flickered, that signal he still couldn't decode, but which he was starting to think meant something adjacent to emotion, something that had bypassed the formal filter. "Among the Soltari, we call that a soul anchor. The item that connects a person to their lineage and their purpose. That you carry one, that you are the kind of person who carries one, told me what I needed to know." "It told you I was worth claiming," he said. He kept the word neutral. He wasn't sure yet whether he meant it as an accusation. "It told me you were the kind of person who would not discard a claim," she said. "Someone who carries a soul anchor does not abandon their bonds." A very long silence. "The retrieval team," he said. "Do you know who sent it?" The briefest pause. "I know who claims to have sent it." "And who actually sent it?" Her four eyes were very still. "I have suspicions that I cannot verify." "If the retrieval team takes you back to the Dominion, and it's the wrong faction." "I am aware of the risk." "And the bond claim. Under treaty law, I'm obligated." "You are not obligated to anything," she said, and her voice sharpened for the first time. "I know your law. The Coalition Treaty recognizes Soltari bond claims for diplomatic purposes but does not require compliance from the human partner. You may renounce it. It causes complications and requires filing the appropriate documentation, but it is your right." She said it completely, evenly. He heard what was underneath the evenness. She'd set this up. She'd chosen him. She'd done it with the full knowledge that he could walk away from it without legal consequence, just diplomatic paperwork, and she'd done it anyway. Because she'd looked at him, and she'd decided he was the kind of person who wouldn't. He turned the ring on his finger. His grandfather hadn't questioned the beach. His father hadn't questioned the valley. He'd never been particularly proud of the Voss family tendency toward walking into things that required walking into. But he'd inherited it completely, and there was something almost peaceful about recognizing that you were about to do a very Voss thing, and doing it anyway. "I'm not renouncing it," he said. She went very still. "Tell me what you know about the retrieval team," he said, "and then tell me what you need." The stillness lasted 3 full seconds long. for someone who moved and spoke with her level of control. Then you understand what you are accepting. I understand that you're the heir to a political structure that's been trying to kill you for 3 years, and that the retrieval team might be part of that structure, and that you were alone and wounded on a hostile planet, and you looked at a stranger and you decided to trust him. He met all 4 of her eyes. I understand all of that. Tell me what you need. A pause that was different from the others, something in it that felt like the breath before a door opens. A witness, she said, when I meet the retrieval team. A coalition witness with treaty standing, who can verify my condition and my statements, and who cannot be silenced by Dominion politics. And if the team is the wrong faction. Her spinal nodes, all of them simultaneously, in a gesture that was clearly involuntary. Then I will need considerably more than a witness. He nodded. Then he reached out slowly, clearly, giving her every opportunity to respond differently, and offered his hand. Not the ring hand, the other one, palm up. She looked at it. Then she placed her 4-fingered hand in his. They held that for a moment, the warm Drevesh minor wind moving between them, the red dwarf light on both of them, one useless moon visible on the horizon. And something happened in that handhold that Declan Voss didn't have a word for in English or Standard Galactic or any other language he'd ever learned. But it happened. Tell me everything, he said. She told him. Chapter 5, Consequences begin. The retrieval team arrived early. Not 36 hours, 22. Which was either a sign of great urgency or a sign that someone had wanted them on the ground before the coalition had finished running verifications, and there was not a comfortable interpretation of either option. There were 7 of them, arriving on a Soltari diplomatic courier vessel that put down in the flat basin north of the camp. 7 was technically appropriate for a Crown Princess retrieval. The honor guard minimum under Dominion protocol was 5. 7 was plausible. 7 was also, as Declan had learned in Jarrell's briefing over the last 18 hours, 2 more than the honor guard minimum, which meant either an abundance of caution or something else. Declan stood at Jarrell's left side in the threshold of the cache. Colonel Reyes stood 3 paces back, which was technically her appropriate distance for a coalition observer. Akafar was somewhere on the ridge with a clear sightline, which was not something anyone had officially sanctioned. The lead retrieval officer was a Soltari male, tall, command markings at the jaw and collarbone, spinal nodes in the high-alert configuration that Declan now knew to look for. He stopped 20 paces out and performed what Declan now recognized as a formal greeting gesture. Spine straight, nodes dimmed, eyes ahead. He spoke in High Soltari. Jarrell replied. The exchange lasted approximately 40 seconds, and Declan understood roughly 40% of it, which was enough to tell him that the lead officer had greeted her by her title. She had confirmed her identity and condition. He had said something about the sovereign's great concern, and she had responded with something that he parsed as formal acknowledgement with an edge of skepticism that the formal register was almost entirely concealing. Then the lead officer's eyes moved to Declan. He spoke again. Declan caught coalition soldier and bond claim with an inflection that suggested disbelief. And explain. Jarrell spoke for a longer stretch. Declan caught witnessed, life debt, covenant touch. And then something he hadn't heard before. A tonal phrase that his limited Soltari vocabulary couldn't reach, but that made the lead officer's spinal nodes flare briefly before being controlled. The officer looked at Declan. Coalition soldier, he said in Standard, you carry the bond claim of the first daughter. Under Coalition Treaty Article 17, yes, Declan said. Documented, witnessed, and registered. You understand that the bond claim establishes obligations. I've been briefed. You understand that under Dominion law, you fall within the protection jurisdiction of House Soltari. I understand that. He kept his voice neutral. I also understand that the same protection jurisdiction applies in the other direction. The officer was quiet for a moment. He had very good control, but his spinal nodes did something small and controlled at that, something Declan had started to recognize as the suppressed version of a larger reaction. "The first daughter returns with us," the officer said, "to the Dominion, to present before the sovereign." "Yes," Gerald said. "I will." She paused, the kind of pause that had weight to it. "As is proper, the bond-acknowledged partner will accompany me to the Dominion threshold as a witness of life debt for the formal record." Silence. The lead officer looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something that had nothing to do with formal protocol. "The coalition soldier," he said carefully, "has not been cleared for Dominion entry. The bond claim creates an automatic entry right under Article 7 of the Covenant Accords, which the Dominion signed 40 years ago," Jarrell said, in the specific tone of someone who has read every relevant legal document and committed them to memory in advance. "Sergeant Voss may accompany me to the threshold." The threshold was a legal term. It meant the First Dominion territory, a reception station that served as a buffer between the Dominion and neutral space. Not the Dominion itself, but not nothing either. Another silence. Declan watched the lead officer calculate. He watched him look at Jarrell, then at Declan, then at the 7-person retrieval team, then back at the two of them. He watched the man decide that the calculation wasn't coming out the way it needed to. "Acceptable," the officer said finally. "Sergeant Voss will accompany the first daughter to the threshold." Declan felt, rather than heard, Colonel Ray's making a sound that was not quite a sigh, and not quite the start of a sentence that she decided not to finish. He didn't look back at her. He had 4 more minutes before the retrieval team's preparation window was up. He stepped slightly aside and said, quietly, to Jarrell, "His nodes did something when you named the obligations, when I said the protection went both directions." She answered just as quietly. "He recalculated." What did he recalculate? Whether the threshold was still the right venue. Her 4 eyes were forward, watching the team. He was expecting to recover me alone. A lone wounded crown princess with political vulnerabilities is manageable. A crown princess accompanied by a coalition soldier with treaty standing and documented bond claim is considerably less so. So he needs to decide whether taking me to the threshold serves his purpose. Yes. What's his purpose? The briefest pause. "I believe," she said, "that his purpose is to recover me in a condition where certain things about how I came to be alone and wounded on Drevesh Minor cannot be effectively reported." The weight of that landed cleanly. "And with me there," Declan said. "With you there, I have a witness who cannot be silenced by internal Dominion politics, who is, by treaty law, protected from interference." She didn't look at him. "I told you I needed a witness. You also said you might need considerably more than a witness." "Yes," a pause. "I am still calculating that probability." He looked at the 7-person team. He did the math in his head, the math that his body had been doing since he was 22 years old and walking into spaces where the numbers didn't favor him. "Akefer's on the ridge," he said. "I know. I identified his position within 10 minutes of his arrival." A small pause. "He is a loyal one, your colleague. He's afraid of Soltari specifically." And yet, Declan agreed. He reached down and touched his ring. The smooth, warm face of it, worn blank by generations of anxious thumbs. His grandfather on a beach, his father in a valley, him on a planet with 2 moons next to a woman who had looked at a piece of gold and decided it meant something. "Jarrell," he said. Her name, he'd said it exactly once before to Ray's in a report. He hadn't said it to her. She went very still. "When we get to the threshold," he said, "and whatever happens there, you're not alone." The the spinal nodes, all of them simultaneously uncontrolled. That signal he'd been cataloging for 18 hours, that he still didn't have a precise translation for, but that he could feel the weight of. "Sergeant Voss," she said. "Declan." A pause, longer than most of her pauses. "Declan," she said, and his name in her phonology was something slightly different, longer in the middle. The consonants softened, something that shouldn't have felt like anything in particular and felt like quite a lot. The lead officer turned and called the boarding call. She moved to meet her retrieval team. Declan Voss, Sergeant, 3rd Asymmetric Unit, Coalition Armed Forces, fell into step at her left side, the shield position, which he couldn't help but notice she didn't tell him to vacate, and walked toward whatever was going to happen next. Behind him, Colonel Reyes said quietly to no one in particular, "Well." And from the ridge, through his earpiece, Okafor said, "For the record, I want it documented that I am going to need something considerably more substantial than a dinner for this." "Duly noted," Declan said. "Are we doing this?" He looked at Jarrell, walking ahead of him in the red morning light, her spine straight and her nodes dimmed to formal position, and her wound still sealed with his bioadhesive at the edges of the Soltari medical dressing. "Yeah," he said, "we're doing this." The courier vessel's ramp lowered. The Soltari retrieval team filed aboard. Declan Voss walked up a ramp onto a Soltari vessel with an ancestral ring on his right hand, and no plan beyond the next hour, which was, he reflected, approximately the same amount of plan he'd had every other time his life had changed direction. The ramp closed behind him. Somewhere on Drevesh Minor, a guitar was still playing Hess's Bad Rhythm and Good Heart, carrying a melody that had been old before anyone alive was born. He couldn't hear it anymore. But he remembered the shape of it. That was enough. End of Part 1. Coming in Part 2. The Dominion threshold holds more than a diplomatic reception. Declan begins to understand the full scope of what Jarrell has survived, and what the wrong faction intends. The bond claim becomes something neither of them can strategize around, and a choice made with 3 words, "You're not alone," starts to cost exactly what choices cost. Word count, words duration at 160 WPM, ~64 minutes. Narrator epilogue between parts. There is a thing about humans that the galaxy tends to underestimate. Not their aggression, everyone knows about the aggression. The Keth lost 2 war fleets to human aggression and rebuilt their entire strategic doctrine around accounting for it. The Pelorum Union renegotiated 3 consecutive treaties specifically because coalition negotiators were too stubborn to take no for an answer, and the Pelorum defined stubbornness as a genetic defect, which is how you can tell the meeting went poorly for them. The Soltari Dominion, sophisticated, ancient, with a military history that made most species feel archaeologically inadequate, had spent the better part of a decade in a state of contested diplomatic engagement with humanity, which is what you call a conflict when you don't want to admit that the species you thought you were managing is managing you. Everyone knew about the aggression. What they kept missing was the other thing. The other thing is harder to document. It doesn't show up in weapon yield assessments or fleet maneuver analyses or the psychological profiles that the Soltari intelligence apparatus maintained on every coalition officer above the rank of specialist. It showed up sometimes in the strangest places. In a rifle put down. In a medkit opened. In a man standing on a planet that was trying very hard to be nobody's concern, watching a woman who had every reason to fight him and every reason to hide, and deciding that both of those reasons were less important than the fact that she was hurt. Jarrell of House Soltari had lived for 31 years inside a political structure that was trying to consume her. She had been trained from childhood to assess threats, to identify loyalties, to read the hidden architecture behind every formal exchange. She had survived 3 years of active internal opposition, 2 assassination attempts, and the specific exhaustion of being heir to something that powerful people wanted her not to inherit. She was not naive. She was not sentimental. She was not the kind of person who made decisions based on instinct. And yet, somewhere on the tilted mineral surface of Drevesh Minor, in the pre-dawn dark of a red dwarf morning, she had looked at a human soldier putting his body between her and a threat, and felt something move through her that her training had no category for. The Soltari word for it was one of the oldest in their language. It predated formal writing, predated the Dominion, predated most of the political and military structures that currently define their civilization. It was the word for the moment when a stranger becomes something else, not friend, not ally, not partner, something that didn't have a clean modern equivalent, because most of the circumstances that created it had been eliminated by political complexity and the general tendency of sophisticated societies to replace genuine things with institutional ones. It meant the person whose loss would cost you something you can't calculate. She had felt it looking at his ring. She had felt it listening to him describe the ring's meaning in simple, direct terms that had nothing diplomatic in them, no strategy, no positioning. Just, it belonged to the people I came from, and I carry it so I remember that I belong to something. And she had made a choice. Not a strategic one, or not only a strategic one. The strategy was real. She'd been honest about the politics, about the protection the bond claim provided, about the vulnerability that traveling alone had created. The strategy was real. But the strategy had been made available by a prior decision that wasn't strategic at all. She had chosen him because he was the kind of person who walked up to a wounded enemy in the dark and said, "I am not hunting you." She had chosen him because he'd read the terrain and adjusted the path without drawing attention to it. She had chosen him because when she'd been unable, in one moment of weakness that she allowed herself and immediately contained, to say the word please in a language that didn't belong to her, he had received it without leverage and without comment. She had chosen him because of the ring. And she had understood, the moment she touched it, felt the warmth of it, felt the weight of something that had been carried through generations of human conflict and human survival, felt what the Soltari would call its soul resonance, that she had calculated correctly. Not because he was a soldier, not because he was useful, because he was, in the precise sense that the word required, a person who knew what it meant to belong to something larger than himself. She needed that, not for the politics, for herself. 31 years inside a structure that was trying to consume her. She had never, not once, allowed herself to want something that wasn't tactical. She wanted this. On the courier vessel, in the seat that protocol assigned her, and that she had specifically angled, so that she could see the doorway where Sergeant Declan Voss of the Coalition 3rd Asymmetric Unit was standing with his ring, and his rifle and his terrible Soltari pronunciation, and his reflex to put his body in front. She sat with the weight of what she'd done, and did not let herself regret it. The retrieval team moved through preparation protocols. The lead officer was performing his composure. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, the assessment, the revision. Declan looked at the lead officer with the specific quality of attention that she recognized as threat assessment. Not aggression, not posturing, just the quiet, comprehensive attention of someone who was filing information for later use. He felt her looking and looked back. She held it for a moment, all 4 eyes. He nodded once, the small nod that meant, "I see you, I'm here," not the performance of protection, the real thing. She turned back to the forward screen, where the stars were doing their ancient, indifferent business. She had lived for 31 years learning not to lean on anything. She was going to have to unlearn that. For the first time in as long as she could remember, that didn't feel like a threat. End of Part 1 complete.